The GPS data was impossible. Natalie Pierce, an experienced hiker who knew every rock on her favorite trail, had walked in perfect geometric circles for over 6 hours straight, not wandering confused circles like a lost person would, but mathematically precise patterns that looked like they were drawn by a machine. When FBI analysts saw the tracking data 15 years later, they knew immediately this wasn't a hiking accident. This was a hunt. What they discovered next would rewrite everything law enforcement thought they knew about predators. Because someone had been watching Natalie for years, studying her every move, and on that October night in 2009, they turned her most trusted place into a psychological torture chamber. The GPS proves Natalie came within yards of escaping multiple times, but each time she got close to safety, something invisible dragged her back into the darkness. And what that something was will make your blood run cold. This is the story of how evil wore the mask of science, and how one woman's final act of defiance exposed a killer 15 years after her death. Ethan Parker still remembered that Tuesday evening like it was yesterday, though 15 years had passed since the worst night of his life. Natalie had kissed him goodbye at 4:45 p.m., grabbed her familiar red backpack, and promised to be home by 8 p.m. for dinner. She never broke her promises. That's what made Ethan fall in love with her in the first place. Her reliability, her dedication to routine, her unwavering commitment to the things and people she cared about. When 10 p.m. came and went with no word from Natalie, Ethan's concern turned to panic. He had tried calling her cell phone dozens of times, but the mountains had no signal. This wasn't like Natalie at all. In 3 years of hiking the same trail, she had never been more than 15 minutes late. She was as precise as clockwork, as predictable as sunrise. The search began immediately. Ethan drove straight to the Pine Ridge Trail parking lot, his headlights cutting through the darkness as he prayed he would find Natalie's car empty, meaning she had gotten a ride home with another hiker. But Natalie's silver Honda Civic sat alone under the flickering parking lot light, her keys still in the ignition. Something she always did because, as she would say, who's going to steal a car in the middle of nowhere? Ethan's hands shook as he grabbed his flashlight and started down the trail, calling Natalie's name into the darkness. His voice echoed off the mountain walls, but only silence answered back. He could see her hiking boots had left clear prints in the soft earth for the first quarter mile, her familiar size 7 treads marking her steady progress into the forest. Then, as if Natalie had simply vanished into thin air, the prints stopped. For weeks, search teams combed every inch of the 2,000-acre forest surrounding Pine Ridge Trail. They brought in bloodhounds that followed Natalie's scent for exactly the same quarter-mile distance before losing the trail completely. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the dense canopy. Volunteer searchers walked shoulder to shoulder through undergrowth so thick they could barely see 3 feet in front of them. The desperate family even hired psychics, though Ethan knew Natalie would have rolled her eyes at the expense. She was a practical woman, a scientist who worked as a lab technician at the county hospital. She believed in facts, evidence, and logical explanations. If Natalie could have seen the fortune tellers claiming to communicate with her spirit, she would have demanded her husband get his money back. But practical or not, Ethan was willing to try anything. Each day that passed without answers felt like another piece of his soul being carved away. Natalie wasn't just his wife. She was his best friend, his hiking partner, his anchor in a world that suddenly felt completely untethered. The official search was called off after 6 weeks. The lead detective, a well-meaning but overwhelmed man named Detective Cole Anderson, sat Ethan down and explained that they had exhausted all conventional search methods. Anderson suggested that Natalie had likely fallen into one of the many ravines or caves that dotted the mountainous terrain, and that her body might never be recovered. Sometimes, Anderson said with the worn-down tone of someone who had delivered this news too many times, the mountains keep their secrets. But Ethan refused to accept that explanation. Natalie was too careful, too experienced, too familiar with that specific trail to simply fall into a ravine. Something else had happened to his wife, something that the investigators were missing. He spent the next 6 years conducting his own searches, following every possible lead, no matter how remote or unlikely. Detective Lucas Bennett inherited Natalie's case in 2015, 6 years after her disappearance. Bennett was younger than his predecessor, more tech-savvy, and had a reputation for approaching cold cases with fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques. Unlike Anderson, who had focused primarily on physical searches and witness interviews, Bennett was fascinated by digital forensics and technological evidence. Bennett spent his first few weeks on the case reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every search report. That's when he noticed something that everyone had overlooked in the original investigation. Natalie's GPS device was still missing. According to Ethan's testimony, Natalie never hiked without her top-of-the-line Garmin GPS unit. It was waterproof, shock-resistant, and designed to withstand extreme conditions. If Natalie had fallen or been injured, that GPS device should have been found with her other belongings. If we could find that GPS, Bennett told Ethan during one of their regular meetings at the small diner where Ethan had become a regular fixture over the years, it might tell us exactly where Natalie went that night. Modern GPS units store incredibly detailed tracking data. We're talking about precise coordinates recorded every few seconds, potentially for hours. Ethan's eyes lit up with hope for the first time in months. He had mentioned the missing GPS device to Detective Anderson years earlier, but Anderson had dismissed it as just another piece of equipment that had probably been lost in the wilderness. Bennett, however, understood that the GPS device wasn't just missing equipment. It was potentially the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. But here's where the story takes its first truly disturbing turn, and I want you to remember this detail because it becomes crucial later. Natalie's GPS wasn't just any hiking device. It was a military-grade unit that Ethan had given her as an anniversary present, the same type used by Special Forces soldiers in combat zones. It was designed to keep working even under the most extreme circumstances, and its memory could store weeks of tracking data. The breakthrough came in October 2024, exactly 15 years after Natalie's disappearance. Construction crews were expanding the Pine Ridge Trail to accommodate increased tourism, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on Ethan, who had watched his wife's favorite hiking spot become a destination for Instagram photographers and weekend adventurers who had no idea they were walking through the scene of an unsolved mystery. The crew chief, Tyler Grant, had been operating a small excavator near the 3-mile marker when his shovel struck something hard beneath the forest floor. Grant initially thought it was just another buried rock. The Appalachian Mountains were full of granite boulders that had been pushed around by centuries of freeze-thaw cycles. But when Grant climbed down to investigate, he realized that rocks don't have zippers. The red backpack emerged from the earth like a time capsule, its bright color still vibrant after 15 years underground. The soil conditions, a mixture of clay and organic matter, had created an almost perfect preservation environment. The backpack was dirty but intact, its waterproof material having protected the contents from complete deterioration. Grant immediately called the state police, and within hours, Detective Bennett was standing over the excavated backpack with a feeling of anticipation mixed with dread. This was the moment he had been working toward for nearly a decade, but he also knew that whatever they found inside that backpack was likely to answer questions that Ethan Parker might not want answered. Inside the backpack, investigators found Natalie's wallet with her driver's license and credit cards still perfectly legible. Her water bottle was still half full, the liquid having evaporated and condensed repeatedly over the years, but leaving mineral deposits that proved it had once contained the sports drink Natalie always carried. There were energy bars, still in their wrappers, and a small first aid kit that Natalie had assembled herself. And there, nestled in a padded side compartment, was Natalie's GPS device. The unit's battery was completely dead after 15 years, but modern forensic technology had advanced considerably since 2009. FBI digital forensics expert Sophia Reynolds was called in to extract data from the device's memory banks, using techniques that hadn't existed when Natalie first disappeared. I've recovered data from devices that have been underwater for years, burned in fires, even damaged in explosions, Reynolds explained to Detective Bennett as she worked on Natalie's GPS unit in her laboratory. The key is that these military-grade devices store data in multiple redundant memory systems. Even if the main memory is corrupted, there are usually backup systems that preserve the most critical information. 3 days later, Reynolds called Bennett with news that would turn the entire investigation upside down. When forensic technicians downloaded the data from Natalie's GPS device, What they discovered defied all logic and challenged everything investigators thought they knew about her disappearance. Reynolds had seen a lot of strange things in her 20-year career, but Natalie Pierce's final tracking data made even her question her own expertise. The data began normally. Natalie had entered the Pine Ridge Trail parking lot at 4:52 p.m. on October 13, 2009, exactly as Ethan had remembered. Her GPS tracked her steady progress along the familiar trail route at her usual pace of 2.5 miles per hour. For the first hour, everything appeared completely normal. Natalie was following her established route, maintaining her regular speed, making progress toward what should have been the turning point where she would head back to the parking lot. But at 6:17 p.m., something changed. According to the GPS data, Natalie suddenly deviated from the trail and began walking into dense forest, moving in a direction she had never gone before in 3 years of hiking the same route. The GPS showed her walking steadily for nearly 2 miles through terrain that was difficult even for experienced hikers, moving through areas with no established trails or markers. And then, at 6:47 p.m., something happened that made seasoned investigators question their own eyes. Natalie Pierce began walking in perfect circles, not wandering aimlessly, not stumbling around in confusion, but walking in geometrically precise circles, roughly 100 yards in diameter. The GPS coordinates showed that for 6 hours and 37 minutes, Natalie maintained this circular pattern with the consistency of a machine. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Reynolds told Bennett over the phone, her voice betraying the confusion she felt. "I've analyzed GPS data from lost hikers, from people suffering from hypothermia, from individuals experiencing mental health crises. People don't just walk in perfect circles for hours, especially not experienced hikers who know the terrain intimately." Something was very wrong that night. The GPS data showed Natalie maintaining her steady pace of approximately 2.5 miles per hour throughout the entire ordeal. She had covered nearly 16 miles total over those 6.5 hours, but had never moved more than 50 yards from the same central point. It was as if she was trapped in some kind of invisible maze, following a path that made perfect sense to her at the time, but appeared completely irrational to anyone analyzing the data later. But the GPS data revealed an even more disturbing detail that would haunt everyone involved in the investigation. At exactly 12:54 a.m. on October 14, 2009, Natalie's movement stopped completely. Not gradually, not with the irregular pattern you might expect from someone who was injured or exhausted, but instantly and permanently. The last ping came from the exact center of the circle pattern she'd been walking for hours. Then nothing. No more movement, no more signals, no more data. It was as if Natalie Pierce had simply ceased to exist at that precise moment and location. Detective Bennett assembled a specialized search team to investigate the area where Natalie's GPS had recorded its final signal. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they focused on a small clearing about 50 yards from where construction crews had found her buried backpack. The dogs alerted immediately. Even the most experienced handlers were surprised by how quickly and decisively the cadaver dogs responded to that specific location. These weren't false alerts or uncertain signals. The dogs were indicating with the kind of confidence that comes from detecting decomposed human remains that have been in place for a very long time. Natalie's remains were found 6 feet underground, wrapped in a blue tarp and weighted down with large rocks in what was clearly an intentional burial designed to prevent discovery. The medical examiner determined she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck by a heavy object, sometime in the early morning hours of October 14, 2009. But the evidence surrounding the burial site told a much darker and more disturbing story than anyone had anticipated. Hidden in the surrounding trees, camouflaged so expertly that they had gone undetected for 15 years, investigators discovered the remnants of what appeared to be a sophisticated surveillance and psychological warfare system. Trail cameras were positioned to monitor the clearing from multiple angles. Motion sensors had been placed along what investigators now realized were carefully planned approach routes. Most disturbing of all, they found speakers that had been wired to a central control system, speakers that could have been used to project sounds designed to disorient and confuse someone in the dark forest. All the equipment was old but military grade, suggesting that whoever had constructed this elaborate setup was both well-funded and experienced in psychological operations. This wasn't the work of an opportunistic criminal or a random act of violence. Someone had spent considerable time and money creating what could only be described as a hunting ground designed specifically to trap and torment human beings. The investigation took a shocking turn when Bennett discovered that the land where Natalie's body was found wasn't actually part of the state park system, as everyone had assumed for 15 years. According to county records, it was private property owned by a shell company called Mountain Research Solutions, LLC. When Bennett traced the ownership of Mountain Research Solutions, he discovered that the company was a front for Jacob Morrison, a 58-year-old former military contractor who had purchased the 200-acre plot in 2007, just 2 years before Natalie's disappearance. Morrison's background made investigators' blood run cold. He had served in the Army's Psychological Operations Division for 12 years, before being discharged in 2005 following serious allegations of conducting unauthorized experiments on military recruits. According to his military records, Morrison had been developing techniques for using sensory disorientation and forced physical exercise to break down psychological resistance in enemy combatants. The specific allegations against Morrison included forcing recruits to perform repetitive physical tasks while being subjected to disorienting lights and sounds, then documenting their psychological deterioration over extended periods. The charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence and Morrison's connections within the military contractor community, but the pattern was undeniably similar to what Natalie had apparently experienced during her final hours. When federal authorities arrived at Morrison's compound in rural Virginia, they found it abandoned but definitely not empty. Morrison had clearly left in a hurry. There were dishes still in the sink, clothes still in drawers, and most importantly for the investigation, a basement office that contained evidence of crimes that extended far beyond Natalie Pierce's murder. In Morrison's carefully organized filing system, investigators discovered detailed surveillance files on 17 different hikers, including Natalie Pierce. These weren't casual observations or coincidental encounters. These were the methodical records of someone who had been conducting systematic surveillance operations over a period of several years. Natalie's file was particularly extensive and disturbing. It contained her hiking schedule, documented over a period of 6 months leading up to her disappearance. Morrison had recorded her arrival and departure times, noted her route preferences, and even included detailed photographs taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions along her regular trail. The photographs showed Natalie in moments of complete privacy and vulnerability, adjusting her backpack, checking her GPS device, even taking water breaks where she thought she was completely alone. The images had been taken from positions that would have required Morrison to hike deep into the forest and wait for hours, sometimes in adverse weather conditions, just to document her movements. But Morrison's surveillance of Natalie went beyond simple observation. His notes indicated that he had been gradually modifying the environment around her regular hiking route, moving trail markers, blocking certain paths, and creating subtle changes designed to eventually force her off her established route and onto his private property. Morrison's personal journals revealed the horrifying truth about what he had been doing on his hidden property and why Natalie Pierce had walked in those perfect circles for over 6 hours. He had been using the isolated location as a testing ground for psychological warfare techniques, specifically targeting solo hikers who followed predictable patterns and schedules. His method was as sophisticated as it was cruel. Morrison would use high-frequency sound devices, strategically placed lights, and carefully positioned reflective surfaces to create what he called environmental disorientation. The goal was to make his victims believe they were still following familiar trails while actually being guided in predetermined patterns that kept them within the boundaries of his property. Natalie had been what Morrison described in his journal as his most successful subject, maintaining continuous movement for over 6 hours despite what he clinically documented as complete psychological breakdown. His notes showed the detachment of a researcher rather than the passion of a killer, as he recorded her increasing panic and confusion with the same tone someone might use to document a laboratory experiment. According to Morrison's detailed observations, Natalie had initially tried to resist the disorientation, attempting several times to walk in straight lines back toward what she believed was the main trail. But each time, Morrison's carefully placed sound and light cues had redirected her back into the circular pattern, convincing her that she was making progress towards safety, while actually keeping her trapped in what he called his behavioral laboratory. The journals revealed that Morrison's interest wasn't primarily in killing his victims, but in studying human psychological endurance under extreme stress. He wanted to know how long people could maintain physical activity while experiencing complete directional confusion, how they would react when familiar landmarks seemed to disappear, and what would happen when their most basic survival instincts were challenged by environmental manipulation. Natalie's death, according to Morrison's notes, had not been planned. His experiment had been designed to continue until she collapsed from exhaustion, at which point he intended to rescue her and document her recovery process. But when Natalie finally stopped walking at 12:54 a.m., she hadn't collapsed from fatigue. She had stopped because she had finally realized what was happening to her. Morrison's final entries about Natalie indicated that she had somehow figured out that her disorientation wasn't natural, that someone was deliberately manipulating her environment. His notes described her standing in the center of the circular path and shouting challenges into the darkness, demanding that whoever was watching her show themselves. It was then, according to Morrison's journal, that his research protocol broke down. Rather than document Natalie's psychological state as she realized the truth about her situation, Morrison had panicked and struck her with a rock, killing her instantly and ending what he had hoped would be a much longer and more informative experiment. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit determined that Morrison had likely killed at least 6 other hikers over a 2-year period between 2007 and 2009. All of his victims were solo hikers who had disappeared from trails within a 50-mile radius of his property, and all of them fit the same profile: experienced, predictable, and isolated. Ground-penetrating radar revealed several other burial sites around Morrison's compound, each containing remains that showed similar patterns of psychological torment before death. The victims had been both men and women, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s, but all sharing the same characteristics that had made Natalie Pierce an attractive target. Morrison himself was found dead in a cheap motel room in Montana, having died by suicide just 3 days before investigators identified him as a suspect. His final journal entry, written on motel stationery in his characteristically clinical handwriting, read, "The experiment is complete. Human endurance under psychological stress has been thoroughly documented. Some subjects exceeded initial expectations for physical and mental resilience. Data analysis will continue in the next phase." The next phase, investigators realized with horror, referred to Morrison's detailed plans for expanding his operation to include multiple testing sites across several western states. His abandoned compound contained maps, photographs, and preliminary surveillance data on potential locations where he could establish new behavioral laboratories designed to trap and study unsuspecting hikers. Ethan Parker stood in the forest clearing where his wife had spent her final hours, now marked with evidence flags and police tape that fluttered in the mountain breeze like prayer flags. Detective Bennett had walked him through everything they had discovered, holding nothing back despite the horrific details of Natalie's ordeal. The clearing looked so ordinary in daylight, just a small patch of level ground surrounded by pine trees and mountain laurel. It was difficult to imagine the psychological horror that had played out in this peaceful location, the hours of terror that Natalie had experienced while someone watched from the shadows and documented her suffering. "She fought," Bennett told Ethan quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of unanswered questions finally finding resolution. "The GPS data shows she tried to break the pattern several times, tried to walk in straight lines toward what she thought was the trail. But Morrison kept redirecting her, using sounds and lights that made her think she was going the right way, while actually keeping her trapped." Bennett showed Ethan a detailed map that forensic analysts had created, overlaying Natalie's GPS tracking data onto a topographical survey of Morrison's property. The map showed not only Natalie's circular walking pattern, but also the locations where Morrison had positioned his surveillance equipment and psychological warfare devices. It was clear from the evidence that Natalie had been fighting against the disorientation for hours, occasionally breaking free from the circular pattern only to be guided back by carefully timed audio cues and strategically placed lights. Her GPS data showed moments where she had walked directly toward the actual trail, coming within yards of escape only to be turned around by Morrison's manipulations. "She almost made it out," Bennett continued, pointing to several locations on the map where Natalie's path had briefly straightened toward the direction of the main trail. Multiple times, she was less than 100 yards from the trail. If she had kept walking straight for just 2 more minutes, she would have found the path and made it home to you. Ethan knelt down and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the center of the clearing, the exact spot where Natalie's GPS had recorded its final signal 15 years earlier. The flowers were mountain laurel and wild rhododendron, the same flowers that had been blooming along Natalie's favorite trail the last time they had hiked together. For 15 long years, Ethan had wondered if Natalie had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had thought about him in her final moments. The GPS data had answered those questions in the most heartbreaking way possible. Natalie had spent hours trying to find her way home to him, fighting against forces she couldn't understand, maintaining hope until the very end. But the data had also revealed something else, something that gave Ethan a measure of peace despite the horror of what Natalie had endured. The precise, determined nature of her movements showed that Natalie had never given up. Even when everything familiar had been stripped away, even when her most basic sense of direction had been manipulated and twisted, she had kept walking, kept trying, kept fighting to return to the life and the love she had left behind. The Pine Ridge Trail was permanently closed to solo hikers following Natalie's case, and new safety protocols were implemented across all state hiking areas. The new regulations required all hikers to carry GPS beacons that would automatically alert authorities if they deviated from marked trails for more than 30 minutes, and if their movement patterns indicated potential distress or disorientation. Trail cameras were installed at regular intervals along popular hiking routes, not for surveillance of hikers, but to monitor for the kind of unauthorized equipment and modifications that Morrison had used to create his psychological trap. Park rangers were trained to recognize signs of environmental manipulation and to identify the psychological warfare techniques that Morrison had pioneered. But for Ethan Parker, the advanced technology and new safety protocols couldn't undo the simple truth that had haunted him for 15 years. Natalie had trusted the woods she loved, and that trust had been used against her by a predator who saw human beings as nothing more than test subjects in his twisted experiments. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan that Natalie's love of hiking, her dedication to routine, and her confidence in the outdoors had all been turned into weapons against her. The very qualities that had made him fall in love with her, her reliability, her adventurous spirit, her trust in the natural world, had also made her the perfect victim for someone who understood how to exploit those strengths. Standing in that forest clearing one final time before Morrison's property was turned over to the state park system, Ethan whispered the words he wished he could have told his wife 15 years earlier. "You can rest now, Natalie. You made it home." The words carried across the mountain air and seemed to settle into the trees that had witnessed Natalie's final hours. In the silence that followed, Ethan could almost hear Natalie's voice responding, the way she used to call back to him when they hiked together and one of them got too far ahead on the trail. The GPS device that had tracked Natalie's final hours now sits in evidence storage at the FBI's Digital Forensics Laboratory, its data having finally served the purpose Natalie would have wanted, bringing her killer to justice and preventing other hikers from experiencing the same fate. The device's memory banks contain not just the record of one woman's final struggle, but also the key evidence that exposed a predator and potentially saved countless other lives. But the perfect circles Natalie walked that October night remain burned into the memory of everyone who worked her case, a geometric pattern of desperation, drawn by a woman trying to find her way home while a monster watched from the darkness and took notes on her suffering. And in the end, it was that same determination that helped solve her case 15 years later. The GPS device she carried, the data it recorded, and the evidence it preserved became the key to exposing her killer and preventing other families from experiencing the same loss and uncertainty that Ethan Parker endured for 15 years. The perfect circles that Natalie walked in the darkness of that October night have been transformed from a symbol of her captivity into a testament to her strength. Each step she took in those calculated patterns was an act of resistance, a refusal to surrender, a declaration that she would not be broken by someone who thought he could reduce her humanity to nothing more than an interesting psychological experiment. Today, hikers who walk the trails near Pine Ridge can see a small memorial plaque that Ethan installed at the original trailhead where Natalie used to begin her Tuesday evening hikes. The plaque doesn't mention the horrific details of her disappearance or the twisted experiments that led to her death. Instead, it simply reads, Natalie Pierce. She never stopped trying to come home. And in many ways, Natalie Pierce did finally make it home. Her case led to safety improvements that protect other hikers. Her story serves as a warning about the predators who disguise their cruelty as science. And her memory lives on in the determination of everyone who refuses to let evil go unchallenged, no matter how long it takes to find the truth. The GPS trail that Natalie Pierce left behind on that terrible October night in 2009 tells a story of human endurance, criminal manipulation, and ultimately, the triumph of truth over deception. It reminds us that even when we feel most lost, most alone, most frightened, we still have the power to choose hope over despair, action over surrender, and love over hate. But there's something else the investigators discovered that they haven't made public until now. Something that makes Natalie's story even more extraordinary and terrifying than the official reports revealed. When Sophia Reynolds analyzed the GPS data with advanced algorithms developed after the case was closed, she found patterns within patterns that had been invisible to earlier analysis. The circles Natalie walked weren't perfectly random. Hidden within the GPS coordinates was evidence that Natalie had been trying to communicate, even as her mind was being systematically broken by Morrison's psychological warfare. The subtle variations in her circular path, when mapped precisely, spelled out letters in the dirt. Not clearly, not obviously, but with enough consistency that advanced computer analysis could detect the pattern. NAT, the first three letters of her name, repeated over and over, as if she was trying to leave a signature in the earth itself, a way to tell the world who she was even if she never made it home. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had lost her mind to panic or fear. This was the desperate intelligence of someone who knew she was being watched, studied, and recorded, and who was fighting back in the only way available to her. Reynolds keeps this analysis in a separate file, one that wasn't included in Morrison's prosecution because he was already dead. But she shows it to every new analyst who joins the FBI's behavioral unit, not as evidence of a solved crime, but as proof of something far more profound about human nature. Look at this data, Reynolds tells them, pointing to the computer screen that shows Natalie's path traced in green lines against a black background. This woman walked in circles for over 6 hours while being psychologically tortured by someone who thought he could reduce her to nothing more than a lab rat. But even as her world was falling apart, even as everything she trusted was being used against her, she was still thinking, still planning, still fighting to maintain her identity. The deeper analysis revealed something else that haunts everyone who has seen it. During the final hour of her ordeal, as Morrison's notes indicate that Natalie had begun to understand what was happening to her, the GPS shows that she stopped trying to escape the circular pattern altogether. Instead, she began walking in increasingly perfect circles, as if she was embracing the geometric precision that Morrison was forcing upon her. But this wasn't surrender. Computer analysis of her final hour shows that Natalie had begun timing her movements to create a specific rhythm, a pattern that served as a countdown. She was preparing for something, gathering her strength for one final act of defiance that Morrison's clinical observations completely missed. The GPS data from her last 30 minutes shows Natalie suddenly breaking the circular pattern and walking in a perfectly straight line directly towards where Morrison was hiding in his observation bunker. She had figured out where he was watching from, and she was going to confront him face to face. That's when Morrison panicked and abandoned his experimental protocol, killing her not in a moment of planned scientific observation, but in a moment of pure fear. The man who thought he was studying human psychological breakdown had instead created his perfect opposite, a woman who had used his own tools of mental torture to locate him and was prepared to face him down in the darkness. Morrison's final journal entries, found after his suicide, reveal his growing terror as he realized that his perfect subject had become something he had never anticipated, a hunter instead of prey. This revelation has changed how the FBI trained agents who work with the missing persons cases. Natalie Pierce's GPS data is now used in psychological resilience training, showing new agents that even under the most extreme circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to fight back, to maintain identity, and to pursue justice. The memorial plaque that Ethan Parker installed at the Pine Ridge Trail now includes a QR code that links to a website he created, not to sensationalize his wife's story, but to educate people about the warning signs of predatory behavior and the importance of situational awareness in remote areas. The website receives thousands of visitors each month, many of them hikers who want to learn how to protect themselves and others. But perhaps the most important legacy of Natalie Pierce's case isn't the safety protocols or the law enforcement training or even the capture of Jacob Morrison's network of potential victims. It's the simple fact that a woman who was supposed to disappear without a trace, who was meant to become just another unsolved mystery, instead became the key to exposing a predator and saving unknown numbers of future victims. Every step Natalie took in those dark circles was an act of resistance. Every turn she made was a refusal to be forgotten. Every mile she walked was a message to the future that she would not go quietly into the darkness that someone else had planned for her. The GPS device that tracked her final hours now sits in the Smithsonian Institution, part of an exhibit on how technology can serve justice even years after a crime occurs. School children visit the exhibit and learn about Natalie Pierce, not as a victim, but as someone who never stopped fighting, never stopped hoping, and never stopped believing that truth would eventually prevail. Ethan Parker, now in his 60s, leads hiking groups for people who have lost loved ones to violent crimes. They walk the trails together not to forget their losses, but to honor the memory of those who can no longer walk with them. He tells them about Natalie, about her determination, about her courage, and about the 16 miles she walked in the darkness to make sure her story would eventually be told. When someone you love becomes lost, Ethan tells the groups, they're not really gone until their story is forgotten. Natalie's story lives on because she made sure it could be told, even when she knew she might not be there to tell it herself. The perfect circles that Natalie Pierce walked on that October night in 2009 have been transformed from a symbol of victimization into a testament to human resilience. They remind us that even when we feel trapped, even when everything familiar has been stripped away, even when we face evil that seems overwhelming, we still have choices. We can still resist. We can still hope. We can still love. And sometimes, just sometimes, that resistance and hope and love can reach across years and miles and speak to future generations, telling them that no matter how dark things get, there's always someone walking the path ahead of them, leaving signs that they are not alone. Natalie Pierce chose hope, walked 16 miles in the darkness to prove it, and in doing so lit a light that continues to shine for everyone who refuses to let evil have the final word. Her GPS trail through the darkness has become a map toward the light, and her story continues to guide others home. If this story affected you the way it affected me, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We investigate cases like Natalie's because these stories need to be told. These victims deserve to be remembered, and these lessons can save lives. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you the most thoroughly researched true crime cases, the ones that law enforcement wants you to know about, and the stories that prove human resilience can triumph even in the darkest circumstances.